The air in the office was stagnant, trapped by four windowless walls. Lucas Bennett pressed his palms against the edge of his desk, feeling the frame shudder under his weight. It was a cheap, uneven piece of furniture that groaned whenever he shifted his position. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen lit up with updates from his former classmates. They were checking in from temperature-controlled boardrooms, surrounded by glass walls and high-rise views, settled into roles at established firms with predictable, six-figure paths. Lucas looked back at the stack of overdue invoices sitting inches from his keyboard. There was no steady paycheck here. There was no air conditioning. Just the hum of a flickering fluorescent light, and the silence of a room that felt entirely separate from the rest of the world. He pushed the phone face down, cleared the invoices to the side, and pulled his laptop into the center of the workspace. He cracked the lid, the screen illuminating his face in the dim light. He did not look at the door. He did not look for an exit. He simply waited for the machine to boot, locked his gaze onto the empty document, and began. The office was a graveyard of abandoned projects. Cables snaked across the floor in tight, impossible knots, tripping anyone who walked too fast. Stacks of unfiled paperwork leaned against the walls like decaying towers. Near the kitchenette, a group of employees hovered around the coffee machine. It had been broken for 3 days, and the sound of their frustration filled the small space. They complained about the bitterness of the instant powder and the lack of a proper machine, their voices rising with every failed attempt to force a brew. Lucas watched them from his desk. He did not join the conversation. He did not lean back or sigh. Instead, he tracked the movement of the project manager, who paced the hallway, clutching a clipboard and muttering about missed deadlines. The clock on the wall ticked, but the work remained stalled. Lucas turned his attention back to the screen. He ignored the hum of the broken machine and the complaints echoing in the hallway. He opened the company server, bypassed the front page, and dove into the raw data. He was looking for the source of the engine failure. He traced the missing payments, the dropped leads, and the silent phones. He did not see a mess. He saw a series of problems waiting for a solution. Lucas tapped the Enter key, closing the diagnostic report he had just compiled. He stood up, the chair scraping sharply against the linoleum floor. The desk was a disaster of yellowed paper and sticky notes. But he began with the invoices. He sorted them by date, then by urgency, tossing the junk mail into a recycling bin until the surface of the desk finally emerged. He wiped away a thick layer of dust with a scrap of paper, leaving a clean, dark rectangle in the center of the wood. The room seemed quieter once the physical clutter was gone. He sat back down and aligned his laptop with the edge of the desk, perfectly perpendicular. He reached under the table, gathered the tangled power cords that had been snaking across the floor, and zip-tied them into a single, neat line. It was a small, quiet victory against the surrounding disorder. He looked at the screen again, the cursor blinking with rhythmic precision. He was no longer just watching the company fail. He was actively carving out a space to rebuild it. He pulled the first stack of invoices toward him, picked up his pen, and began the work of untangling the debt, one page at a time. The madness of the office continued around him, but at his desk, the sequence of his own progress had officially begun. The lunch hour arrived. Chairs scraped, doors slammed, and the office emptied as his colleagues filtered out to find food. Lucas stayed. He did not pull out a sandwich or browse his phone. He opened the company's sales portal and maximized the window until the dashboard filled his entire view. He began to map the customer journey from the first click to the final drop-off. He clicked through every node, tracking the bounce rates at each stage of the funnel. He noticed a recurring silence in the data. Customers were reaching the final checkout page, pausing, and then vanishing entirely. It happened at the same time every afternoon, across multiple regions, without a single logged error. He pulled up the server logs to compare the traffic spikes against the abandoned carts. The pattern was undeniable. A technical bottleneck was forcing a system timeout, effectively deleting potential revenue before the transaction could clear. He leaned back, his eyes scanning the numbers as the realization settled in. While everyone else was complaining about the lack of amenities, he had located the primary point of financial hemorrhage. He grabbed a notepad and began sketching the flow, mapping out the exact point where the system failed. He had the answer, and for the first time, he knew exactly how to stop the bleed. Lucas spent the next hour distilling the data into a 3-page brief. He wrote clearly, avoiding jargon, focusing entirely on the correlation between the system timeouts and the revenue loss. He printed the document, the hum of the printer sounding unnervingly loud in the quiet office. He read it once more, checking the logic of his proposed solution. It was a gamble. He was an intern, and uninvited suggestions were often treated as interference. He stood up, the paper cool and firm in his hand. He walked toward the glass-walled office at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar. He paused, his pulse ticking against his collar, and looked back at his colleagues who were still chatting about trivialities. He didn't wait for permission. He stepped inside, placed the report squarely in the center of the mahogany desk, and retreated before he could second-guess the motion. Back at his own station, he kept his eyes on his monitor, though his focus had entirely shifted. Every time the office door creaked, he flinched. He watched the reflection in his screen, waiting for the founder to pick up the pages. He had laid his cards on the table. Now, the silence of the room felt heavy, expectant, and sharp. The office door swung open. The founder stepped out, the pages of the report held in his hand. He walked straight to the desk where Lucas sat. He did not ask who had written the analysis. He simply tapped the paper against his palm and looked Lucas in the eye. "The client is arriving in 20 minutes, the founder said. "They are unhappy, and they are threatening to pull the contract. Lead the meeting." He turned and walked away before Lucas could offer a word. The weight of the request hit like a physical blow. Lucas looked at the clock. 20 minutes. He had never spoken to a client, let alone managed a crisis. The office felt suddenly smaller, the air thinner. He stood up, his legs steady despite the sudden spike in his heart rate. He grabbed his laptop and a stack of blank sheets. He knew the data inside the report was accurate, but translating that into a conversation required more than facts. It required control. He walked toward the conference room, smoothing his hands against the sides of his trousers. The door to the boardroom was closed. He reached for the handle, took a single, deep breath, and pushed the door wide open. The test had begun. The client sat at the far end of the table, arms crossed, staring at the wall. He did not look at Lucas. He looked at his watch. Lucas didn't open with pleasantries or corporate history. He plugged his laptop into the projector and swiped to the third slide. It was a graph showing exactly where the client's service was failing, and a second chart mapping the fix. The client shifted in his chair, leaning forward as the data appeared. Lucas pointed to the bottleneck, his voice steady. "You are losing 15% of your traffic here because your load balancer isn't configured for these spikes. My team can patch this by tonight." The silence in the room changed from hostile to focused. The client stopped looking at his watch and started looking at the screen. He tapped his pen against the table, a rhythmic, rapid sound. He asked a question about server latency. Lucas answered without hesitation, pulling up the technical logs he had analyzed that morning. The client's posture broke. He dropped his arms and reached for his notepad. When the slide deck ended, the tension had evaporated, replaced by the sound of the client's pen scratching out notes. The contract was not just saved, it was renegotiated. The office was quiet, but it was the wrong kind of quiet. The marketing lead had walked out an hour ago, leaving his desk stripped bare. No files, no notes, just a computer screen glowing with an error message and a half-empty coffee mug. The founders stood in the hallway, heads together, whispering about the quarterly targets now left completely unmonitored. The company was drifting. Lucas watched them from his corner, his own work already finished. He didn't wait for an invitation or a meeting to discuss the strategy. He stood up, walked past the founders, and entered the marketing lead's office. The air smelled of stale paper and dust. He sat in the abandoned chair and turned the monitor toward him. He saw the ad dashboards, the raw data, and the sheer chaos of unmanaged campaigns. It was a mess, but it was also a massive opportunity. He pulled a notebook from his pocket, logged into the master account, and began to audit the spend. He reached for the phone to call the platform representative, his fingers moving across the keyboard with intent. The founders stopped talking and looked toward the office, watching the new occupant take control of the void. The dashboard was a maze of red lines and stagnant numbers. Lucas ignored the recommended settings. He filtered by search intent, stripped away the broad match keywords that were draining the budget, and rewrote the ad copy to target high-conversion queries. His fingers moved in a rhythmic blur across the keys. Every click was a calculated risk. For 3 hours, he monitored the impact, refreshing the page until the graphs shifted. A thin green line began to climb, breaking through the previous plateau. He identified a cluster of keywords that had been neglected for months and redirected the entire underperforming budget toward them. The bounce rate plummeted. Then, the conversion notification dinged on his screen. Then another. He pulled the report, showing a 20% jump in just one afternoon. The founders walked by, stopped, and stared at the terminal. They saw the numbers. They saw the efficiency. Lucas didn't look up. He was already auditing the next campaign. He was no longer a temporary assistant shifting files. He was the machine driving the company's pulse. The office space felt different now, centered on his desk, fueled by the velocity of his results. The office lights flickered and died, leaving only the blue glow of his laptop. Lucas stayed. He kept a worn copy of a book on his desk, its pages marked with heavy ink lines. He read the same passage until the words burned into his focus. Do more than you are paid for. He closed the book and looked at the pile of tasks he had already cleared. Most would have gone home. Most would have logged off, satisfied with the day's successes. Lucas pulled a blank notebook toward him. He listed every function of the business, from customer support to inventory management. He was not on the payroll for these roles, but he began drafting protocols for them anyway. He studied the logic of high-level systems, mapping out how to build value where none existed. His perspective shifted. The desk was no longer a station for an intern. It was the command center for an owner. He stopped measuring his time by the clock and started measuring it by the output. He internalized the principle that payment was merely a byproduct of service. By the time he finally stood up to leave, the office felt different. It was no longer a place he visited, but a responsibility he carried. He walked out into the cool night air, already planning the next day's expansion. The morning began with the usual hum of activity, but it died within an hour. A single email notification flashed on the main server, followed by a chain of red alerts. Lucas watched the screen as the logistics dashboard turned entirely amber, then deep, warning red. Every shipment scheduled for the quarter had been halted at the port. The silence that followed was heavy. He walked into the central office, where the founders sat motionless. Their hands were empty, resting on desks covered in useless, outdated schedules. They were staring at their monitors, faces drained of color, unable to speak or move. The air in the room grew cold as the weight of the situation settled in. They were looking at bankruptcy in real time. Every order was stuck. Every contract was now a liability. No one picked up the phone. No one dared to draft a recovery plan. The startup had hit a wall, and the momentum they had built over months vanished in 60 seconds. Lucas stood in the doorway, watching the paralysis take hold. He realized that the infrastructure he had helped build was currently a ghost system. If they stayed silent for another hour, the company would cease to exist. The founders were waiting for a miracle, but all Lucas saw was a problem that needed a solution. The clock on the wall ticked with a sound like a hammer hitting iron. Every second was a debt they could not pay. Lucas moved to the center of the floor, his boots crunching on a stray paperclip. The founders remained locked in their chairs, their breathing shallow and rhythmic, like people waiting for a storm to pass. But there was no storm coming. There was only the end. He checked the status board again. The red alerts blinked. A relentless pulse of failure. If the shipments did not move by midnight, the contracts would trigger a penalty clause, and the startup would fold. Lucas felt the temperature of the room drop. The hum of the servers sounded like a dying engine. He walked to the window and looked out at the city, where thousands of people were going about their lives, unaware that his entire world was stalling. He turned back. The silence in the office was a physical weight, pressing against his chest. He looked at the empty phones on the desks. They were tools, but they were currently useless. He realized then that he was the only person in the room who had not accepted defeat. Everything he had helped scale, every hour he had poured into the company, was about to vanish. He took a breath, stepped toward the main desk, and reached for the receiver. Lucas dialed the first number. He spoke for 3 minutes, then slammed the receiver down. The contact had refused to even check the warehouse capacity. He immediately punched in the next sequence. He didn't wait for a dial tone. He kept his finger on the pulse of the industry, calling every logistics provider in the tri-state area. His hand trembled from the grip on the phone, so he switched ears. He poured a third cup of black coffee, the liquid splashing over his knuckles, but he didn't wipe it away. He kept dialing. 1 hour passed, then 4. He navigated through automated systems, bypassed gatekeepers, and demanded to speak with floor managers. Every rejection was a data point. Every no was a prompt to call a different regional lead. He used a highlighter to cross out names on the master list as he went. His eyes burned, fixed on the blinking light of the phone console. He took no breaks. He drank the coffee cold. He kept the line open, his voice rasping as he recited the company requirements to a logistics officer in Chicago. The office lights flickered, casting long shadows across his desk, but he didn't look up. He was already dialing the next number before the current one finished ringing. The sun hit the office glass, turning the dust motes into gold. Lucas had been awake for 47 hours and 12 minutes. His throat felt like sandpaper. He dialed the final number on his list, a regional freight director in Phoenix. He spoke with a voice that cracked, citing the exact volume of the backlog and the specific delivery window required. The director on the other end paused. The silence lasted 5 seconds. Then, the director agreed to the terms. Lucas did not cheer. He did not smile. He simply repeated the confirmation number back, his pen digging deep into the notepad until the tip snapped. He hung up the phone. The office was empty, save for the hum of the servers, which now sounded steady, rhythmic, and alive. He pushed the chair back and stood up, his knees locking, his vision blurring at the edges. He walked to the main terminal and sent the routing coordinates to the warehouse floor. The status board shifted from blinking red to a solid, stable green. The penalty clause was voided. The shipments were cleared for transport. He sank back into his chair, the weight of the last 2 days pulling his head down toward his chest. He had done more than his job description. He had kept the company breathing. He closed his eyes, the sound of the office ventilation filling the room. Lucas moved his desk into the main office the following Monday. The founders no longer asked for updates. They waited for his directives. He was officially named coordinator, then director within 6 months. He stopped optimizing single spreadsheets and began restructuring the entire logistics chain. He audited every department, cut the redundant workflows, and replaced sluggish vendors with high-performance partners. He spent his days in the conference room, mapping out growth trajectories on the glass walls with black markers. When the company hit its first major revenue milestone, he didn't stop to celebrate. He logged back into the CRM, identified the next bottleneck, and assigned a team to resolve it within the hour. He moved through the office with a stack of files in one hand and a tablet in the other, constantly adjusting the pace of operations. The startup was no longer a mess of tangled wires. It was a calibrated machine. He demanded the same intensity from the staff that he had applied to himself. The growth graphs on the wall began to climb at a vertical angle. He was no longer just filling a role. He was building the infrastructure for a national player, one process at a time, keeping his focus fixed on the next objective. The startup outgrew the original office in under a year. Lucas oversaw the move into a glass-fronted facility that spanned 3 city blocks. He walked the perimeter of the new floor, checking the server racks and the layout of the sales desks. Where once he had managed a handful of files, he now directed regional managers in 5 different time zones. He spent his mornings on video calls, synchronizing logistics across the country, and his afternoons in the boardroom, finalizing expansion contracts. The company was now a national player, its logo visible on shipping containers from coast to coast. He built out specialized teams for customer retention, supply chain management, and data analysis. He moved through the halls with a purpose that forced others to step aside, reviewing quarterly projections that dwarfed their initial startup goals. He installed whiteboards in every conference room, mapping out the next phase of the nationwide rollout. The tangled wires and broken equipment of the early days were forgotten, replaced by high-performance hardware and a workforce that operated with his own signature intensity. He stood at the center of the hub, watching the flow of data and personnel, seeing the architecture of the business finally match the scale of his initial, singular ambition. The noise of the office floor faded behind the heavy glass door of his private suite. Lucas crossed the room, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He moved to the mahogany desk, sat down, and placed his phone aside. The view from the window overlooked the city he had helped map with logistics hubs and regional offices. He opened his laptop, the screen illuminating his face in the dim light. He navigated to the banking portal, his fingers pausing briefly over the trackpad. He entered the security credentials and waited for the page to refresh. The cursor blinked rhythmically against the white background. Then, the balance updated. 6 figures had become 7. $1 million. He stared at the digits. the silence of the room heavy with the weight of the years spent in that cramped, windowless office. He leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking. There were no cheers, no celebrations, just the steady, quiet realization of a goal finally met. He closed the laptop, the screen going dark, and looked out at the skyline. The work had defined the path, and the path had led exactly where he had calculated it would. He sat in the stillness, observing the city lights as they began to flicker on across the horizon. A soft, rhythmic knock broke the stillness of the suite. Lucas turned his chair toward the door as it swung open. A young person stepped into the room, holding a stack of files against their chest. The person stopped a few feet from the desk, looking around at the expansive office with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. They stood perfectly still, eyes darting from the high-end hardware to the view of the skyline beyond the glass. Lucas watched them, noting the way their grip tightened on the paperwork, a physical echo of his own first day in that cramped, windowless office years ago. The intern cleared their throat, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and took a cautious step forward. They set the files down on the edge of the mahogany desk, their movements precise and deliberate. Lucas waited, keeping his posture relaxed. The intern looked up, locking eyes with him across the workspace. A question hung in the air, unvoiced for a long second as the intern searched for the words. Finally, the intern spoke. "How do I reach your position?" The question lingered between them, a bridge spanning the years from the bottom of the ladder to the top. Lucas did not answer immediately. He stood up, the chair pushing back against the carpet with a soft slide. He moved slowly, his gaze fixed on the whiteboard that spanned the far wall of the office. The intern watched his movements, eyes following the arc of his hand as he picked up a black marker. Lucas pulled the cap off, the click echoing in the room. He walked to the center of the board, his posture upright and deliberate. He pressed the marker to the surface and began to write, each letter formed with heavy, purposeful strokes. Titles follow responsibility. The marker squeaked once against the smooth white surface. He capped the pen and set it down on the tray, the sound punctuating the silence. He turned to face the intern again. The words remained on the board, stark and immovable. He watched for the reaction, waiting for the realization to settle in. The air in the room felt different now, charged with the weight of that single sentence. He had not given a roadmap or a shortcut. He had given the fundamental law of his own climb. He stood there, hands clasped behind his back, letting the intern read the lesson as many times as it took for the meaning to take hold. Lucas turned his back on the whiteboard and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling glass. He placed his palms against the cool surface, looking out at the city grid. From this height, the streets looked like narrow veins, pulsing with the same urgency he had felt all those years ago. He watched the flow of traffic and the movement of people far below, seeing the patterns of a system he had learned to navigate. He had never waited for a ladder to appear. He had built one, rung by rung, task by task. Through every crisis and every missed opportunity he had claimed as his own. His reflection in the glass was steady. He traced the skyline with his eyes, identifying the reach of his company's influence. The office, the view, and the balance in his account were not accidents of timing. They were the physical results of years spent working beyond the scope of any job description. He pulled his hands away from the glass, leaving faint marks on the pane. The internship had not been a temporary role. It had been the blueprint for every brick of this empire. He looked back at the intern, who was still staring at the board, and finally, he understood the value of the climb.